First, a story worth watching for, one that relates to the Federal Police raid on News Corp journalist Annika Smethurst earlier this year. Her story suggested the government was considering giving the Australian Signals Directorate new powers for mass surveillance on domestic soil. The government's long maintained that was never under consideration. But active consideration has been given to how to plug so-called gaps in Australia's cybersecurity with new powers that I understand will be unveiled early next year. These new laws and a new enhanced role for the Australian Cybersecurity Centre are being worked on, being progressed right now, with legislation set to be introduced in the new year. What would these new powers for the Cybersecurity Centre aim to do? Well, two things primarily. One, stop the live streaming of child abuse or torture on the dark web. The Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, has spoken about this problem a number of times over the last 6 months or so, including at a meeting of the Five Eyes intelligence partners in London back in July. Offenders use anonymous search engines and websites to hide who they are, where they are, when they're transmitting some of this abhorrent material. That is something the Australian Signals Directorate apparently does have the capability to crack, but it cannot focus on domestic targets under current laws. The second aim of these new powers is to protect critical infrastructure here, like banks, electricity companies, the stock exchange and so on, against the threat of sophisticated cyber attacks from foreign state actors. The Home Affairs Secretary touched on this last week when he was before a Senate committee.
The very issue that was set in motion between the Home Affairs Department, the Department of Defence and the Australian Signals Directorate was the extent to which one day, and hopefully we can close this gap in sufficient time before that day comes, the equivalent of a cyber Pearl Harbor, that we can close the gap in terms of what the private sector can do on things like the electricity grid, our gas and water supplies, sensitive data holdings, traffic management systems, other critical pieces of national infrastructure, most of which are held quite properly for economic reasons in the private sector. But the extent to which the margin of risk that they carry cannot be remediated by any private sector action.
Mike Pizzullo giving some hints there last week that the private sector simply cannot prevent what he calls a Pearl Harbor-style cyber attack. In other words, only specialised government agencies have that capability. He again stressed at this hearing last week that they're not talking about mass surveillance. This is about narrowly targeting powers to stop the streaming and sharing of child abuse and, as you heard there, to protect critical infrastructure against sophisticated cyber attacks. Here's the thing, how do you do that when the Australian Signals Directorate cannot, by law, collect intelligence on domestic soil? As I understand it, what is now under active consideration is to give the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which falls under the Australian Signals Directorate, new powers to protect critical infrastructure in the private sector, the banks and so on, as well as protecting children from online exploitation. The key word here is protect, not collect. Right now, the Cybersecurity Centre can only advise the private sector. This new law would give it the power to actively play a protection role as well. It would be a much enhanced role for this agency. It would become a far more powerful agency than it is right now, either remaining within the Australian Signals Directorate or being separated out. As I understand it, there is some internal resistance to going down this path, but watch this space. The details are coming in the new year.